The galaxy is vast, far beyond what anyone could truly imagine, with billions of stars scattered across endless stretches of space. In this enormous expanse, countless worlds revolve around their suns, each with its own unique story, culture, and life. Most of these worlds are unknown to humanity, drifting silently in the void, hidden from the gaze of explorers. But some of these planets send signals, teeny whispers carried through the darkness, sometimes accidentally, sometimes as calls for help. It was one of these faint whispers that changed everything. On a small, remote human colony situated at the edge of known space, sensors had begun picking up an unusual signal. It was unlike the usual background noise of cosmic radiation or the static interference from distant stars. At first, technicians thought it was a technical glitch, perhaps a damaged antenna or a minor calibration error. But the signal persisted, faint yet distinct, like a soft voice struggling to be heard over the roaring silence of space. The scientists and engineers at the colony listened carefully, leaning closer to the screens, their curiosity growing with each passing moment. There was something in this signal that felt different. Decoding the signal was not easy. It was fragmented, scattered across various wavelengths, and seemed almost deliberately disguised. Whoever or whatever had sent it did not possess technology as advanced as the interstellar communication systems humans had developed. Still, there was an unmistakable pattern, a rhythm that resembled a cry for help. It was brief, incomplete, but the urgency was evident. The message carried a tone of panic, fear, and desperation, emotions that transcended language and species. It did not take long for the colony's lead scientists to realize that this was not an ordinary broadcast. It was a distress call. When the message reached the central databases of human deep space listening posts, it triggered immediate attention. These posts were scattered across human-controlled sectors, constantly scanning the dark void for anything unusual. They were designed to detect anything from distant supernova to covert signals from other civilizations. But what they found in this case was extraordinary. The faint SOS originated from a star system that had never been charted in human records. The coordinates pointed to a cluster of planets orbiting a sun that shone dimly, a system isolated and hidden from casual observation. Whoever was sending the message was located far away from known trade routes or colonies, making the message even more compelling. Admiral Yolan Ward, commander of the Vanguard fleet, was called to review the decoded signal. Ward had spent decades navigating the edges of human territory, dealing with both hostile and neutral alien species. He was a man of few words, with a reputation for calmness under pressure, yet his mind was always sharp and vigilant. Sitting in front of the large holographic display, he watched the signal unfold, piece by piece. The patterns of sound and light flickering across the screen conveyed more than just data. They spoke of urgency, danger, and a plea that could not be ignored. Ward felt a chill run through him, not because of fear for himself, but because of the knowledge that somewhere, far from human space, an intelligent civilization was in immediate danger. The signal revealed glimpses of the beings themselves. They were unlike anything Ward had encountered before. The visuals transmitted were rudimentary, distorted by interference and distance, yet they showed creatures that were fragile-looking and clearly unprepared for conflict. They moved with caution and fear, and their structures seemed delicate, unlike the reinforced space stations humans had grown accustomed to. Ward noticed their eyes, or the equivalent of eyes wide with panic, scanning their environment for threats. It was evident that their technology was not on par with humanity's. They had no massive warships, no advanced weaponry, no shields strong enough to withstand a major attack, and yet they were sending out a desperate call, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer. Across the fleet and colonies, debates began almost immediately. Some argued that this was not humanity's problem, that intervening in a conflict on an alien world could be risky. Political leaders questioned the authenticity of the signal, wondering if it could be a trap, a test, or a misinterpretation. The unknowns were many. Could the beings be hostile once approached? Could the message have been sent for manipulation or even to lure humans into a dangerous ambush? Every possibility was being considered. But for Ward in his inner circle, the decision was simpler. The message, despite its uncertainties, carried a truth that could not be ignored. These creatures were pleading for help, and they were defenseless. The history of the Deathworlders influenced Ward's thinking. Humans who had settled in extreme hostile worlds over the centuries earned the name Deathworlders for surviving environments that would have crushed ordinary civilizations. They had faced deadly planets with toxic atmospheres, aggressive predators, and deadly radiation. And yet they had not only survived, they had thrived. That resilience gave the Vanguard fleet a unique perspective. If they could survive and adapt to worlds that were outright lethal, then surely they had a responsibility to extend their aid to those who could not defend themselves. Their ethos was not about conquest or dominance. It was about protection and survival. As Ward reviewed the transmissions, he began to understand the scale of what he was dealing with. The message was more than a simple SOS. It was a glimpse into the suffering of an entire civilization. Cities appeared burning, structures collapsing, and figures running in panic. There was no time for hesitation, no room for political debates or cautious diplomacy. The visuals painted a scene of imminent destruction, with lives hanging in the balance. Ward's experience told him that in situations like this, the first response was often the most critical. Delay could mean complete annihilation. The signal also carried subtle hints about the threat. The patterns of destruction suggested a highly organized and aggressive force. These were not natural disasters or internal conflict. There was intent, strategy, and precision behind the chaos. Whoever was attacking the alien world had superior firepower and tactics, and the aliens themselves were ill-equipped to resist. The contrast between the attackers and the victims was stark, highlighting the vulnerability of the species reaching out for help. Ward could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. To act or not to act would have consequences that extended far beyond his immediate fleet or even human space. Preparation for intervention began quietly, behind closed doors. Fleet officers studied the star system's data, mapping potential entry points, hazards, and unknown variables. Reconnaissance probes were launched to gather more information without alerting potential enemies. Ward held briefing sessions with his senior commanders, emphasizing both the importance and the delicacy of the mission. He reminded them that while they were humans with advanced technology and deadly efficiency, the goal was not to dominate or exploit, it was to save lives. Every plan, every calculation, and every resource allocation was directed toward that single purpose: reaching the aliens in time to prevent their extinction. Amidst all the strategy and preparation, there was also a personal element. Ward thought about what it meant to be at the edge of the galaxy, listening to a civilization in distress that had never had any contact with humanity. He imagined the fear, confusion, and helplessness of the beings sending the signal. He understood that hope, even in the most desperate situations, was a fragile but powerful thing. Just a single sign that someone was listening could change everything for them. Ward felt the urgency acutely, as though the very silence of space was waiting for a response, holding its breath along with the endangered aliens. As the Vanguard fleet readied itself for mobilization, the story of the SOS began spreading quietly among the colonies. Scientists, engineers, and officers all shared fragments of the transmissions, piecing together the narrative of a world at risk. Each person who saw the signals felt the same mixture of awe and concern. They were witnessing a moment in history, the first confirmed call for help from an intelligent species beyond humanity. It was both terrifying and inspiring, reminding everyone that the galaxy was alive with unseen lives, some of which might never ask for aid unless someone dared to listen. The decision to act was not just strategic, it was moral. For Ward and the Deathworlders, ignoring the SOS was not an option. Their reputation across human space was built on resilience, courage, and an unspoken promise: they protect the vulnerable when no one else will. This principle guided every maneuver, every calculation, and every communication that would follow. In the quiet of the command room, Ward gave the order that would set everything in motion. The Vanguard fleet would move toward the alien world, ready to face whatever dangers awaited, driven by the belief that no plea for help should ever go unanswered. By the time the first ships began leaving the docks, the faint signal continued to flicker across deep space scanners, fragile and urgent. It was a reminder that, out there, beyond the safety of human colonies, lives hung in the balance. Somewhere on that distant world, beings stared into the darkness, hoping for salvation that might come from stars they had never imagined. And as the Deathworlders fleet began its journey, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if courage, compassion, and skill could meet the desperate call echoing across the void. Every crew member on the ships understood the gravity of the mission. They were not just sailors, pilots, or soldiers. They were witnesses to a new chapter in interstellar history, part of a story that would define what it meant to answer a call for help when the odds were stacked impossibly against you. There was fear, yes, but also determination, hope, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that humanity, even on the edge of the galaxy, could rise to meet unimaginable challenges. On that moment, the signal was more than an SOS. It was a bridge between two civilizations, a test of courage and empathy, and the spark that would ignite a chain of events neither species could yet fully comprehend. The Deathworlders fleet, legendary for surviving the deadliest planets and hostile sectors, was about to embark on a mission that would cement their legacy as protectors of the helpless and champions of life in a universe where survival was never guaranteed. And so, the stage was set. The distant SOS continued to flicker across sensors, persistent and unwavering, calling out across the void. It was a fragile thread connecting to civilizations, one desperate for help and one ready to respond. The journey had begun, and with it, the story of courage, strategy, and compassion that would unfold across the stars, shaping destinies in ways no one could yet predict. As the Vanguard fleet left human-controlled space, the crew could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Every ship hummed with quiet energy, engines calibrated for long-distance travel, and weapons systems checked and rechecked. Though the mission was clear: reach the source of the alien SOS as quickly as possible, there were still many unknowns. The farther they traveled into the uncharted sectors, the more unpredictable the universe became. Stars flickered through the vast darkness, some alive with planets and life, others cold and dead. It was in this borderland between the familiar and the unknown that the real challenge began to emerge. The initial scans of the alien system revealed more than just coordinates. The Alrithi homeworld, a fragile blue-green planet circling a dim star, was caught in a region of space that was strategically important, not just for them, but for other, less friendly powers. Long-range sensors picked up unusual energy signature signs that a hostile force had established presence near the planet. The Iron Serpents, as intelligence reports later identified them, were a marauder faction known for ruthless raids and territorial domination. Their ships were designed for speed, efficiency, and destruction, capable of striking with devastating precision. The moment the Deathworlders analysts realized this, it became clear that the mission was more than a simple rescue. It was a confrontation with a dangerous enemy within the fleet. Discussions were tense but determined. Ward convened a private council with his senior commanders. They gathered in the command chamber, the walls glowing softly with holographic displays of the alien system and the surrounding sectors. Each display highlighted potential hazards, asteroid fields, gravitational anomalies, and clusters of enemy ships. Every detail was a risk, but they had no choice. The Alrithi lives depended on them, and hesitation could cost countless lives. Ward's voice was calm but firm as he addressed the officers. "We are entering a contested zone. Every decision we make from here will have consequences. We are here to protect, not to provoke, but we must be ready for confrontation. Our advantage is speed, strategy, and the fact that we are prepared. Their fear is as much a weapon as their firepower. We cannot afford mistakes." Meanwhile, the crew members on board the individual ships were bracing themselves for the unknown. Some were veterans of past conflicts on harsh planets, while others were younger, their training limited to simulations and controlled encounters. Yet, every soul on the fleet felt the weight of responsibility. The Alrithi, a species entirely new to human eyes, were depending on them, and their desperation was evident even in the fragmented transmissions. Engineers meticulously checked systems, navigators plotted precise courses through dangerous gravitational pockets. Medical teams reviewed protocols for potential casualties. Every action, every preparation was a step toward saving a civilization teetering on the edge of annihilation. As the fleet moved closer, further transmissions began arriving. These were even more fragmented than the first, but they painted a terrifying picture. Entire settlements were under attack, structures collapsing in fire and smoke. Figures could be seen running frantically, some carrying the injured or the young, all fleeing toward the edges of destruction. The attackers were relentless, efficient, and clearly prepared for total domination. The Alrithi had no comparable technology, no defensive measures strong enough to hold back such an assault. Even from a distance, it was obvious that the survival of the species depended on immediate intervention. One of the most challenging aspects of the mission was the political uncertainty. Human colonies and governments were cautious, concerned about interfering in a conflict that was technically beyond their borders. They debated the legality, the ethics, and the risks. Some feared that engaging could spark a broader conflict, drawing human forces into a war with a faction they did not yet fully understand. These debates trickled down through the ranks, creating a subtle tension within the fleet. Ward, however, reminded everyone that this was about life, not policy. The choice was simple. Delay could mean extinction for an entire species, and moral responsibility outweighed bureaucratic hesitation. The closer the fleet got, the more complicated navigation became. The system was surrounded by asteroid belts, magnetic storms, and pockets of unstable energy that could scramble sensors or damage ships. The Iron Serpents had clearly taken advantage of this environment, using natural hazards as shields for their patrols. The Deathworlders had to move with precision, balancing speed with caution. Any misstep could leave them vulnerable to attack or delay the rescue. The fleet's navigators worked tirelessly, plotting courses that threaded through dangerous regions with millimeter accuracy, often relying on instincts honed from years of experience, surviving in the most hostile conditions imaginable. As the fleet approached the outer system, long-range sensors detected the first signs of the enemy. Small skirmish ships darted between asteroids, monitoring for intruders. Their movements were calculated, almost predatory, testing the fleet's response. Ward observed them carefully. "This is not just a fight," he said quietly. "This is a test. They are measuring us, probing for weakness. We must show discipline and strategy. Panic is not an option." Communication with the Alrithi remained limited. The language barriers made full translation difficult, but emotion and intent were clear. The transmissions showed fear, confusion, and a desperate hope for salvation. Crew members who watched these visuals were affected deeply. Even the most hardened soldiers found themselves pausing, staring at the alien figures fleeing their homes, understanding in a profound, human way the vulnerability and fragility of life, even across species. These moments reinforced the importance of their mission and solidified the resolve of every person aboard the fleet. One of the critical challenges emerged from understanding the enemy's capabilities. The Iron Serpents were not just raiders, they were tacticians who exploited fear and unpredictability. They used ambush tactics, flanking maneuvers, and decoy strategies to overwhelm weaker forces. Human intelligence had some information, but nothing that could capture the full scale of their cruelty or ingenuity. Each new piece of data from long-range scans increased the complexity of the mission. Ward knew that failure was not an option, yet the unpredictability of the enemy made it clear that every decision carried a significant risk. The psychological strain on the fleet's crew also became apparent. Extended travel through uncharted regions, combined with the constant anticipation of encountering both the Alrithi and their attackers, created tension and fatigue. Officers held regular briefings to manage morale and focus, emphasizing teamwork, resilience, and trust in training. Ward encouraged open dialogue among the crew, acknowledging fear while reinforcing the purpose of the mission. He reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. For many, this was the first real test of that principle in the vastness of space. As the days passed, new patterns of the enemy's presence became apparent. The Iron Serpents did not simply occupy the planet. They had established strategic control over key regions, cutting off escape routes and targeting vital infrastructure. This meant that any rescue operation had to account for multiple simultaneous threats. The fleet began to develop multi-phase strategies, assigning specialized teams to different roles. Some focused on evacuation, others on disabling enemy positions, and some on creating protective barriers for vulnerable areas. Coordination and timing became crucial, as even minor delays or errors could result in catastrophic loss of life. The rising challenge was not only external. Internally, the fleet had to manage the limitations of human technology and biology. Long-range operations required careful monitoring of supplies, fuel, and life support. Engineers and medical teams worked in constant vigilance to prevent any failures that could jeopardize the mission. Even minor malfunctions in deep space could escalate into life-threatening crises. The complexity of these operations mirrored the rising threat outside, demanding constant attention and adaptability from everyone involved. Ward continued to emphasize the human element in all planning. Technology and firepower are important, he told his commanders, but empathy, judgment, and decisiveness are what make the difference. We are here to save lives, not just to fight. Remember that every action has a direct impact on beings who cannot defend themselves. This focus on morality and responsibility strengthened cohesion within the fleet, reminding each crew member that their mission went beyond strategy and tactics. It was a test of humanity at its best. Amidst all these challenges, a breakthrough came from the analysis of new Alrithi transmissions. Although the messages were brief and disrupted, they revealed information about the planet's geography, safe zones for civilians, and weak points in the enemy's positions. Analysts worked around the clock, piecing together a clearer picture of the situation. These insights were invaluable, allowing the fleet to plan targeted interventions that minimized risk and maximized the chances of saving lives. Every small detail uncovered was a victory in itself, reinforcing the importance of persistence, observation, and careful study even in the most desperate circumstances. The emotional stakes of the mission continued to rise. The Alrithi were not just faceless creatures. They were intelligent, feeling beings, whose lives depended on the success of the fleet. As more images and fragments of transmissions reached the fleet, the humanity of the situation became undeniable. Crew members who had trained for decades to face mechanical or biological threats now faced the reality of dealing with sentient lives at risk. This realization drove every decision, every maneuver, and every calculation. By the time the fleet neared the inner system, the challenge had reached its peak. The Iron Serpents had fortified key positions, and the planet's surface was under siege in multiple locations simultaneously. The Alrithi were trapped between the enemy and the vacuum of space, with nowhere to run. This was the moment when all preparation, strategy, and courage would be put to the ultimate test. Ward knew that the next steps would define not only the outcome of the rescue, but also the reputation of the Vanguard fleet and the Deathworlders as a whole. Failure was not an option, and the rising challenge had transformed into an urgent, immediate need for action. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the fleet had faced before. The combination of an intelligent, endangered species, a ruthless enemy, and the unpredictable environment of an uncharted star system created a scenario of extreme complexity. Every decision carried weight, every delay had consequences, and every risk could be fatal. The rising challenge was no longer a distant concept, it was immediate, tangible, and unavoidable. As the Vanguard fleet approached the Alrithi system, tension on every ship became almost palpable. The deep space scanners had picked up more enemy vessels than anticipated, scattered across the system like predatory shadows waiting for an intruder. The Iron Serpents were clever, cunning, and ruthless, and the more the fleet observed, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary raid. They were dealing with a force that had been planning this attack for months, maybe even years. Admiral Yolan Ward stood on the bridge of the flagship, his eyes fixed on the holographic display showing the system. The movements of the enemy ships were precise, calculated, and intimidating. Every step the fleet took had to be meticulously planned, because a single mistake could lead to disaster. The first sign that the situation had escalated beyond expectation came when the fleet intercepted a live transmission from the Alrethi planet. The transmission was fragmented, barely audible, but the visuals were devastating. Entire cities were engulfed in flames, and smoke rose from structures that had once housed families and communities. Figures could be seen running through burning streets, trying to carry the wounded or protect the young. The panic in the alien faces was unmistakable. Even at this distance, the raw fear of a species that had never known organized war was evident. The images shook everyone on the fleet. These were intelligent beings, entirely unprepared for this level of violence, and the urgency of the rescue became almost suffocating. Ward called a meeting with his senior commanders. The briefing room was filled with tension, officers leaning over holographic displays, analyzing enemy positions and possible strategies. "They are more organized than we expected," Ward said, his voice steady but heavy with concern. "The Iron Serpents are not just raiding, they are systematically eliminating resistance, cutting off escape routes, and fortifying positions around critical points. We have to act, and we have to act now, or we will arrive too late." He paused, scanning the faces of his officers. "We cannot allow hesitation. Every decision from here on out will define the survival of an entire species. We are the only chance they have." The fleet divided into specialized squadrons, each assigned specific roles. Some were tasked with direct engagement to draw enemy attention away from the planet's surface. Others were assigned to protect potential escape routes for civilians. A smaller unit was designated to intercept transmissions and relay critical updates back to the command ship. Every move was coordinated with precision, but the complexity of the situation made perfect coordination nearly impossible. The enemy had adapted to long-range attacks and was using stealth tactics to mask their positions, making every approach a calculated risk. On board the individual ships, crew members braced themselves for the unknown. Pilots ran simulations and recalculated their flight paths dozens of times. Engineers double-checked weapon systems and propulsion units, and medical teams prepared for a possible influx of casualties. Anxiety mixed with determination, as everyone understood the stakes. This was no longer a mission of exploration or reconnaissance, it was a race against time to save lives. And failure was not an option. Every crew member knew that if they faltered, entire cities of beings could be wiped from existence before their eyes. The first skirmish began unexpectedly. A patrol of Iron Serpent fighters emerged from the asteroid belts near the outer system, attempting to intercept the fleet before it could reach the interplanetary orbit. The attack was swift and brutal. Lasers streaked across the darkness of space, ships maneuvered with lightning speed, and explosions illuminated the void like distant fireworks, only far more deadly. Ward monitored the battle with intense focus, issuing orders with calm precision. Deploy defensive grids, cover the evacuation routes, focus fire on their lead ship. Every command had to be executed perfectly, as a single misstep could allow the enemy to strike directly at the fleeing Alrethi below. As the engagement continued, the fleet realized that the Iron Serpents had anticipated their approach in some areas, using decoy ships to lure squads into traps. The Deathworlders' training and experience became critical. Pilots used evasive maneuvers learned from surviving hostile planets. Engineers adapted weapons in real time, and Ward coordinated strategies that balanced aggression with caution. The enemy was relentless, striking in waves, testing the fleet's limits, and seeking to exploit any moment of hesitation. Meanwhile, on the surface of the Alrethi planet, the situation grew more desperate. The fragmented transmissions showed civilians fleeing toward the few areas not yet overtaken by the attackers. Families were torn apart in the chaos, some hiding while others were forced into open areas where they were vulnerable. The urgency for the fleet to intervene became almost unbearable. Ward, watching the feeds, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Each moment lost could mean lives that could never be recovered. He realized that the mission had transformed from a rescue operation into a full-scale confrontation, where timing, strategy, and courage would decide the fate of an entire species. As the fleet pressed deeper into the system, they encountered more unexpected hazards. Debris from destroyed ships and stations created treacherous fields that could easily damage even the most heavily armored vessels. Magnetic storms interfered with sensors, making it difficult to track enemy movements accurately. The Iron Serpents used these conditions to their advantage, attempting to hide their positions and ambush the fleet at the most vulnerable points. Ward and his commanders had to constantly adjust plans, adapting to shifting circumstances, often making decisions with incomplete information. Every choice carried the risk of catastrophe, yet hesitation was impossible. At one critical moment, the fleet received a direct visual from a large city under attack. The camera feed showed the Iron Serpents deploying heavy assault units, their weapons cutting through buildings with terrifying efficiency. The Elrithi defenders were overpowered, their limited technology no match for the attackers' advanced weaponry. Children and elders fled through the streets, while families clung to each other in panic. The transmission ended abruptly as the signal was disrupted by enemy interference, leaving only the memory of chaos and destruction. This visual marked the turning point for Ward and the fleet. There was no more room for cautious planning. The fleet had to act decisively to prevent complete annihilation. Ward gave the order to move into the inner system orbit. Despite the significant risks, "We are engaging directly," he said, voice firm. "Our priority is the civilians. Our secondary objective is neutralizing the threat. Timing is critical. We cannot afford mistakes." The fleet shifted formation, entering the danger zone with precision. Shields activated, and weapon systems online. The Iron Serpents attempted to counter with everything they had, but the Vanguard fleet's coordination and training proved superior. Every squadron executed its maneuvers flawlessly, drawing enemy fire away from key evacuation routes and creating opportunities for the Elrithi to escape. On the ground, the Elrithi began to sense a shift. Though the fleet was still distant, the appearance of human ships in orbit disrupted enemy operations. Panic among the attackers grew as they realized that reinforcements had arrived. Civilians, sensing hope, began moving toward safer zones designated in the earlier transmissions. Ward watched this carefully, understanding that psychological impact was as important as physical intervention. The appearance of help could inspire courage and buy critical moments for evacuation. However, the Iron Serpents were far from defeated. They unleashed their heaviest weapons, striking at both the fleet and the planet simultaneously. Energy blasts shook the orbit, creating waves of destruction and threatening to cut off escape paths. Crew members worked tirelessly, adjusting shields, recalculating trajectories, and responding to emergencies. Engineers patched breaches in real time while pilots executed daring maneuvers to intercept enemy fire. Every second was a battle, both against the enemy and the harsh environment of space itself. During this escalation, one of the most critical moments occurred when a large enemy vessel attempted a direct assault on the city, where most civilians were concentrated. The fleet's response had to be immediate. Ward coordinated a multi-pronged attack, while one squadron engaged the enemy ship head-on. Another deployed diversion tactics to draw away supporting vessels. Simultaneously, the fleet projected protective energy grids over the city, giving civilians a temporary shield while evacuation teams moved them to safer zones. The coordination was flawless, a testament to years of training and experience. Yet it required absolute trust and split-second timing. The Elrithi civilians, watching from the surface, could only see streaks of light and explosions above their cities. They did not fully understand the mechanics of the battle, but they sensed the presence of allies. Hope, fragile but powerful, began to spread among them. Families clung to one another as they moved through the streets, following the faintly marked paths toward temporary shelters. The fleet's actions, though distant and overwhelming in scale, had a tangible impact on their survival. Ward continued to monitor every aspect of the engagement. He knew that the Iron Serpents would not give up either. They were adapting to each maneuver, seeking new weaknesses, and exploiting any gap. Every strategy had to be revised on the fly. Communications flowed between ships, squads adjusted positions, and resources were reallocated constantly. The critical moment of the mission was not a single event, it was a continuous series of decisions, each more important than the last. As the fleet fought both the enemy and time itself, as the battle raged, the fleet achieved a decisive advantage. The coordinated efforts overwhelmed the attackers' formations, disabling key vessels and forcing the remaining ships into retreat. The protective grids allowed civilians to begin organized evacuation, moving toward orbiting transports and secure locations. Ward allowed himself a brief moment of relief, knowing that the critical point had passed, but he remained vigilant. The Iron Serpents were still dangerous, and the mission was far from over. The success of this escalation depended on maintaining focus, adapting to new threats, and ensuring that every life possible was saved. Fleet had established control over the inner system orbit, disrupted the enemy's operations, and secured a pathway for evacuation. The Elrithi was still in danger, but the immediate threat had been mitigated. Ward and his commanders took stock of the situation, reviewing damage reports, ship status, and the progress of the rescue operations. They knew that the battle was only the beginning, but they had crossed the critical threshold. The escalation had tested every skill, every decision, and every ounce of courage the fleet possessed, proving that when lives are at stake, strategy, determination, and human or Deathworlder ingenuity could overcome even the most terrifying odds. With the fleet holding control over the inner system, the real work of saving the Elrithi began. The critical moment had passed, but the challenge of turning victory in space into tangible rescue on the planet's surface was only just beginning. Every ship in the Vanguard fleet shifted focus from combat to coordinated evacuation. Protective shields that had been used to block enemy fire were now expanded and moved into position over cities and escape corridors, forming safe paths through the chaos. The crew worked tirelessly, their training and discipline pushed to the limits, yet fueled by the knowledge that lives were depending on them. Every second counted, and there was no room for error. On the planet, the Alrithi were slow to understand what was happening. They had never witnessed this level of organized response from another species. Some were skeptical at first, thinking the distant ships might be another enemy trick. Others, seeing the protective energy shields cast over the streets and settlements, began to realize that help had arrived. Word spread quickly, even among fragmented groups of survivors, creating pockets of hope where only fear had existed moments before. Families reunited wherever they could, guiding the young, the elderly, and the wounded toward the narrow corridors designated for evacuation. The visuals from the fleet's cameras provided guidance, showing where the shields were strongest, and sensors helped map out debris-filled streets and unstable structures. Admiral Ward oversaw the entire operation from the flagship, monitoring multiple feeds simultaneously. His mind moved constantly between strategic planning, real-time adjustments, and the human, or in this case Alrithi, element of the rescue. He knew that coordinating thousands of evacuees while maintaining defensive readiness required absolute precision. Orders were transmitted instantly to smaller squadron leaders, who in turn directed individual pilots and transport units. Engineers rerouted power to expand shield coverage in the most densely populated areas, while medical teams prepared for triage stations in orbiting ships and transport vessels. Everything was a delicate balance between speed, safety, and efficiency. One of the first major successes came when a transport squadron reached the city's central square. Hundreds of civilians had gathered, hesitant to move until they understood that the shields provided genuine protection. Once the transports hovered in formation, protected by energy fields and flanked by defensive ships, the evacuees began moving with cautious urgency. The fleet's soldiers assisted where possible, lifting those who could not move quickly and guiding families along the safest paths. The streets were chaotic, but the coordination from above made what seemed impossible entirely achievable. However, the Iron Serpents were not finished. Even after their main formations had been disrupted, smaller groups attempted hit-and-run attacks, targeting vulnerable zones and trying to disrupt evacuation routes. Ward's experience in hostile environments proved invaluable. He immediately redeployed fighter squadrons to intercept the raiders, using speed and calculated aggression to keep the attackers at bay. Defensive drones patrolled streets from orbit, creating mobile shields and decoys to confuse and delay any enemy incursion. It was a delicate dance, a simultaneous offensive and defensive operation, where any mistake could spell disaster for the Alrithi on the ground. As evacuation continued, Ward personally monitored one of the most dangerous zones, a residential district heavily damaged by enemy fire. The buildings were unstable, fires burned unchecked, and civilians were trapped in pockets of debris. He directed a squadron of specialized rescue drones to enter the area first, clearing paths, lifting rubble, and providing light and communication to guide the survivors. Once the area was deemed safe enough, transport units descended to extract the civilians. The process was painstaking, but every life saved was a victory, and morale across the fleet surged with each successful rescue. Meanwhile, the Alrithi leadership, who had initially hidden in fear, began to take active roles in helping their people. Ward made efforts to communicate with them through the fragmented transmissions, using universal symbols and simplified signals to guide them. Though the language barrier remained, understanding was possible through gestures, visual cues, and coordinated actions. The leaders directed their people toward designated safe zones, helping to maintain order amidst the chaos. Ward noted the importance of collaboration, realizing that even in the most technologically advanced rescue, the knowledge and cooperation of the local population were crucial. The evacuation faced its most significant test when a massive enemy squadron attempted to ambush one of the main transport routes. Ward and his commanders quickly assessed the situation, realizing that a direct confrontation could put civilians at risk. Instead, they executed a flanking maneuver, sending a smaller but highly trained unit to draw the enemy away while the transports continued on a parallel route protected by expanded energy shields. It was a risky move, requiring precise timing and flawless coordination, but the maneuver worked. The enemy, confused and unable to predict the fleet's tactics, was forced to retreat, allowing the evacuation to continue uninterrupted. As civilians reached orbit, medical teams immediately began triage, treating injuries sustained during attacks and from collapsing structures. Doctors, nurses, and engineers worked together to stabilize the wounded, distribute supplies, and ensure that every evacuee was accounted for. Ward personally oversaw the operation, understanding that these were not just numbers or missions, they were lives, each with a history, a family, and a future. The enormity of the task was staggering. but every successful evacuation reinforced the sense of purpose and the urgency that had driven the fleet from the very beginning. By now, communication between the fleet and the Alrithi had improved, thanks to persistent efforts from linguists and engineers aboard the flagship. Basic instructions and guidance could now be transmitted reliably, allowing for more organized evacuation efforts. Groups of civilians who had previously wandered aimlessly in panic were now able to find their way to safety. Ward recognized that establishing this communication was as important as any combat maneuver, for understanding and coordination were the keys to minimizing casualties and ensuring that the evacuation proceeded efficiently. As the evacuation progressed, the fleet also turned its attention to securing the planet from further attacks. While the Iron Serpents had been driven back, remnants of their forces remained scattered throughout the system, capable of striking isolated targets. Ward deployed rapid response units to patrol the planet's orbit, monitor for potential threats, and intercept enemy vessels attempting to regroup. Defensive drones and automated turrets were positioned at strategic points to deter any attacks on key evacuation corridors. The goal was to create a secure environment long enough to extract as many civilians as possible before considering the planet stabilized. During this intense phase, individual acts of bravery and ingenuity became essential. Pilots risked their lives to guide transports through hazardous areas. Engineers modified shields and propulsion systems in real time, and soldiers descended to assist civilians trapped in debris. Each action, though small in isolation, contributed to the overall success of the operation. Ward made it a point to recognize and coordinate these efforts, understanding that in such a massive operation, the smallest acts could make the difference between life and death. As night fell on the Alrithi planet, the evacuation reached its climax. The majority of civilians had been transported to orbiting vessels, where temporary shelters provided safety and medical care. Fires still burned on the surface, and some smaller pockets of survivors remained. But the bulk of the population was now out of immediate danger. Ward assessed the situation carefully, coordinating a final sweep with ground sensors and reconnaissance drones. Every possible civilian was accounted for, every evacuation corridor secured, and the Iron Serpent forces significantly weakened. The critical moment had passed, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and lives had been saved. Despite the exhaustion and the intensity of the operation, the mood aboard the fleet was one of cautious triumph. Crew members allowed themselves brief moments of relief, knowing that they had not only fought and survived but had successfully saved an entire species from near extinction. Ward, however, remained vigilant. The operation was far from over, and while the immediate danger had been addressed, long-term security, the welfare of the evacuees, and potential future threats required continued attention. His mind was already planning the next steps, ensuring that the hard-won success would not be undone. Throughout the fleet, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. The combination of strategy, courage, and compassion had turned a desperate situation into a success. The Alrithi civilians, many still shaken and traumatized, began to comprehend the scale of what had been done for them. Though words were limited, gestures of gratitude and relief were unmistakable. Families huddled together, some embracing for the first time in days, while others simply looked up at the hovering fleet in awe, realizing that their lives had been spared by beings they had never known. Ward took a moment to reflect on the operation. The resolution of the crisis was not just about military skill or technological superiority. It was about understanding the stakes, responding with courage, and committing fully to the task of saving lives. He recognized that while the Iron Serpents was still a threat in the galaxy, the successful evacuation demonstrated what disciplined coordination, clear leadership, and unwavering purpose could achieve. The operation had been a testament to the power of preparedness, adaptability, and empathy, even in the vast, uncaring expanse of space. As the fleet began organizing the survivors for relocation to safer human-controlled regions, Ward allowed himself a moment to acknowledge the enormity of what had been accomplished. Lives that might have been lost forever had been preserved, and the bonds of trust and cooperation between the humans and the Alrithi were being forged in real time. It was a reminder that in the darkest moments, decisive action, courage, and humanity could make the difference between extinction and survival. The immediate threat had been neutralized. The majority of civilians had been rescued, and the Alrithi could begin to rebuild, even if the process would take time. The fleet had proven that with preparation, focus, and a commitment to protecting the vulnerable, even the most desperate crises could be overcome. The resolution was not just a tactical victory, it was a demonstration of the values that defined the Deathworlders and their fleet: courage, resilience, and a steadfast commitment to doing what was right, no matter the odds. With the Alrithi civilians safe aboard orbiting transport vessels, the immediate crisis had finally passed. Yet, aboard the Vanguard fleet, the feeling of relief was tempered by the awareness that the operation was far from complete. The evacuation had been successful, but the galaxy was vast, full of uncertainties, and there were still lingering threats. Admiral Yolan Ward moved quietly through the command deck, observing the flow of activity. Crew members worked tirelessly to catalog survivors, distribute supplies, and repair the wear and tear on ships from the intense engagement. The fleet was physically exhausted, but mentally and emotionally, everyone carried the weight of what had occurred. They had witnessed suffering, fear, and courage on a scale unlike anything they had encountered before. They were still trying to comprehend the sheer scale of what had happened. Moved cautiously among the human personnel, many were quiet, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events that had gone from near destruction to safety in a matter of hours. Others expressed their gratitude in ways humans could understand. Gestures, symbols, and the occasional hesitant words translated through the fleet's communication systems. Though the language barrier remained a challenge, the emotion behind their actions was unmistakable. Relief, hope, and appreciation flowed through the fleet as the Alrithi began to understand that they had been saved, not by chance but by deliberate, calculated, and compassionate intervention. Ward called a series of debriefings with his senior officers to assess the operation in detail. Every action, from the fleet's initial entry into the system to the last transport landing, was analyzed. Lessons were discussed, mistakes noted, and successes celebrated. Ward emphasized that the operation had been a collective achievement, a combination of planning, courage, and adaptability. He wanted to ensure that everyone understood not just the outcome but the processes and decisions that had led to it. The fleet had learned that in interstellar rescue missions, strategy alone was not enough. Empathy, intuition, and respect for the beings they were saving were equally important. While the immediate threat from the Iron Serpents had been neutralized, Ward knew that danger still lingered. Reconnaissance drones continued to monitor the system for remnants of enemy forces, and rapid response units were kept on standby. The Iron Serpents were cunning and resilient. They might attempt to regroup, launch counterattacks, or exploit vulnerabilities left by the evacuation. Ward and his commanders understood that security was not merely about physical presence but about maintaining vigilance, communication, and strategic advantage over potential threats. Every precaution was taken to ensure the Alrithi would remain safe even after the fleet departed. As the hours passed, the Alrithi began tentative steps toward understanding their rescuers. Some of their scientists and leaders worked alongside the fleet's engineers, exchanging knowledge about technology, energy systems, and communication methods. Others shared information about the planet's geography, local resources, and societal structure. Though it was clear that full collaboration would take time, even these initial interactions were valuable. Ward recognized that building trust was as important as the physical rescue itself. The Alrithi needed not just protection, but also reassurance that the humans who had saved them were allies, rather than a transient force that might leave once the immediate danger passed. Psychologically, the impact on both humans and Alrithi was profound. Crew members of the fleet had witnessed scenes of fear, despair, and resilience that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Many were seasoned veterans, accustomed to hostile planets and dangerous missions. Yet the experience of saving an entire species from annihilation carried a different kind of weight. It was a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and reflection, a recognition that their actions had real consequences beyond mere strategy or survival. For the Alrithi, the trauma of the attacks remained, but it was now accompanied by hope. They had seen firsthand that help could arrive, even from a species entirely unlike their own, and that the universe could hold unexpected allies. The aftermath also brought logistical challenges. Transporting thousands of civilians to orbiting shelters, providing food, water, medical care, and psychological support required meticulous planning. Ward personally oversaw the allocation of resources, ensuring that no Alrithi went without assistance. Medical teams established temporary triage centers on multiple vessels, treating injuries ranging from burns to broken bones to trauma-induced shock. Engineers worked to repair minor damage to the transports, maintaining their structural integrity and ensuring that all evacuees could be safely relocated to more permanent accommodations in human-controlled regions. Every aspect of the aftermath required coordination, focus, and patience. Meanwhile, intelligence officers continued to analyze the Iron Serpent's behavior, tactics, and potential future strategies. They reviewed every transmission, sensor reading, and debris pattern to understand the enemy's mindset and capabilities. Ward knew that knowledge gained from this mission would be critical for future operations, both to protect the Alrithi and to safeguard human interests in nearby sectors. The escalation, battle, and rescue had provided an unprecedented dataset on how the Iron Serpents operated, and the fleet could now better anticipate, prepare for, and counter similar threats in the future. The human crews also took moments to connect with the Alrithi on a personal level. Language barriers, limited conversation, but shared experiences, gestures, and observation created bonds. Young Alrithi who had been terrified during the attack began to recognize and trust the humans who had saved them. Adults who had witnessed the destruction saw that the fleet's actions were deliberate, compassionate, and disciplined. Across the vessels, small acts of kindness, providing blankets, comforting children, sharing food helped build bridges of trust that would endure beyond the immediate crisis. Ward recognized that these bonds were as important as any strategic victory. Rescue was not merely about survival. It was about establishing connection, understanding, and mutual respect between two very different civilizations. Reflection on the broader implications of the mission became a central theme for Ward. He considered the lessons learned not only in terms of tactics, technology, and coordination but also in terms of morality, responsibility, and the role of humans in the galaxy. The Alrethi had reached out across the void, trusting that someone would respond to their cry for help. Humanity had answered, not because of obligation or gain, but because it was the right thing to do. Ward understood that the story of this rescue would resonate far beyond this single mission, shaping perceptions of humanity and the Deathworlders as a whole. It would serve as a precedent for how intelligent species could collaborate, protect, and respond to those in need. For the aftermath was a mixture of relief, gratitude, and cautious optimism. Communities had been spared, though the physical and emotional scars were deep. Leaders began organizing their people, accounting for the missing, rebuilding infrastructure, and establishing safe zones. There was a sense of awe and respect for the humans who had intervened, tempered by the realization that their survival depended on continued vigilance. The fleet's presence had transformed the situation from one of hopelessness to one of possibility, offering a tangible example of what cooperation across species could achieve. Ward also reflected on the nature of heroism and responsibility. The fleet had faced a nearly insurmountable challenge, yet through training, planning, and determination, they had succeeded. The rescue had required more than firepower. It had required courage, patience, and a commitment to acting decisively under pressure. He recognized that the mission's success was not only the result of skill but of a shared belief in the value of life, no matter how different or distant the beings involved. The mission had demonstrated that moral courage could be as important as tactical expertise in determining outcomes. Communication with human leadership continued even as the fleet began preparing to depart the Alrethi system. Ward briefed political leaders on the current status, emphasizing both the success and the remaining challenges. Recommendations were made for continued protection, potential reconstruction assistance, and ongoing monitoring of the Iron Serpent's movements. Ward's reports were detailed, not just in terms of statistics or logistics, but in terms of human and Alrethi experience, the lives saved, the trauma endured, and the hope inspired. The aftermath of this mission would influence policy, strategy, and interstellar relations for years to come. The fleet's crew took time to decompress. Small celebrations occurred in pockets aboard different ships, but Ward insisted on maintaining vigilance. The operation had been successful, yet it had tested everyone physically, mentally, and emotionally. Crew members shared stories of bravery, of quick thinking, of moments when hope seemed lost but determination prevailed. These reflections served both as a reminder of what had been achieved and as preparation for future missions, reinforcing lessons learned and building cohesion among the fleet. As the fleet prepared to escort the Alrethi to a safer sector, Ward observed the alien civilians one last time from the flagship bridge. They were still cautious, still processing everything, but there was a noticeable change, a spark of trust, a sense of safety, a faint but unmistakable hope. Ward felt a profound satisfaction, knowing that the fleet's actions had made a lasting difference. This was the ultimate reward of the mission, seeing that the lives of thousands had been preserved, that a civilization could continue to exist, and that the principles guiding the Deathworlders, courage, compassion, and responsibility had been proven effective in the most challenging of circumstances. As the Alrethi were relocated and the fleet began charting a course back toward human-controlled space, Ward allowed himself a final moment of reflection. The mission had been unprecedented in scope and intensity, yet it had reaffirmed a fundamental truth. In a galaxy filled with uncertainty, danger, and chaos, decisive action and moral clarity could transform despair into survival. The fleet's journey had shown that when beings answered a call for help, even across the vastness of space, the ripple effects could be profound, altering destinies, forging bonds, and setting a standard for how civilizations could respond to one another in times of crisis. Even as stars stretched infinitely in every direction, the knowledge of what had been accomplished lingered. The Alrethi had survived, human lives had been tested and proven, and the galaxy had witnessed a story of courage, empathy, and skill that would endure. Ward and his fleet understood that the aftermath of this mission was not merely about recovery and reflection, it was about legacy, about proving that even in the darkest corners of the universe, life could be protected, and hope could flourish. The echoes of this operation would resonate through generations, a testament to what could be achieved when bravery, planning, and compassion converged in the face of overwhelming odds.